You matter. You matter. You matter. Till the day that you die, you will matter. And I hope you can see that you're worth being free, 'cause you matter.
In my series on positional narcissism, I've introduced the concept of an embryonic fantasy. And I mentioned that the embryonic fantasy is a fantasy in three parts. There's a fantasy about the past, which I believe impacts our perception of the Garden of Eden. And there is also a fantasy about the future, which I believe impacts our perception of what we tend to call heaven. And also a fantasy about responsibility itself, which has a very powerful impact on how we relate to God. Today, I want to focus primarily on the Eden and heaven portions of this fantasy, because we have these fantasies that really don't match anything that the Bible says. And unfortunately, fantasies might feel nice, but they're never actually helpful. We have very good reasons for having these fantasies. I mean, how many people truly have good enough parents who give them a foundation of a healthy pattern or healthy model for the teeter-tottering in relationship? Very few of us had that. And in the absence of that, it's so much easier to say blame Adam or Eve or the snake or the tree. It's so much easier to blame that than to say my parents weren't good enough parents. And it's also easier to fantasize about a heaven where we just float along and everything happens for us, when we don't even have the first inkling of what it would take to change how we relate to each other and to God and to life in the here and now. So that's what we're going to talk about today, a little bit about what the Bible actually says about Eden and heaven, and we'll take it from there. My name is Carissa Schalk, and thank you for joining me for this Bible study. Please give this video a thumbs up and share it with your friends and enemies alike. When you subscribe to the channel, be sure to also click the little bell icon and you'll receive notification when I post new videos. In the comment section below, please let me know which points you found particularly useful or meaningful and which points you'd like to see clarified or expanded on in future videos. You can follow me on Facebook and Instagram, and you can find more information in the details either below or beside this video when you click on More below. There you will also find the link to my online store, and I hope you'll visit and make some purchases. At the time of this recording, I have 1 novel and 2 CDs of original music available. To get a feel for the content, be sure to stay tuned, because at the end of each video, I'll have a brief excerpt from the novel or one of the CDs. And now, back to our Bible study. In our fantasies about Eden, it tends to go something like Eden was this absolutely beautiful place where everything was peaceful and lovely, and Adam and Eve just walked around naked. And sometimes people tend to put God in this picture as well, that Adam and Eve walked in unbroken fellowship with God and everything was just wonderful all the time. And then they had this conversation with the snake, and then Eve just blew it, and that was the end. And now we're all stuck being miserable. Until we get to heaven, of course. But what the Bible actually says about Eden, or I should say about the garden that was in some proximity to Eden, is quite a bit different from that, actually. There was no wild plants or grains growing because there was no human to till or work the soil. So God planted a garden, and then he formed the human from the soil and put the human in the garden. And his purpose for putting the human in the garden was for the human to work. That's not irresponsibility at all. That's not just wandering around enjoying everything all the time. There's no actual record of Adam working while still in the garden, but Genesis is very explicit that that was the purpose of the human being formed, for placement in the garden. Very specifically for him to tend it, to till it, to keep it. Even to the Hebrew words there could be interpreted as guarding it, which means there were predators. Whether those predators were in the garden or outside of the garden, it doesn't really indicate, but there would be no reason to keep the garden if there were no predators. There would be no reason to guard it. And if everything just grew beautifully and nothing was required of Adam, then why was he needed for the garden to exist? The garden was created, it appears the garden was created specifically for Adam. And the very idea of a garden is that it had boundaries. So there were obviously edges to this. There were edges to what Adam was given dominion over. There were edges to his responsibility. But he had responsibility. The responsibility was very definitely there. So Adam was formed, he was placed in the garden, he was given some instructions, then God said it's not good for the human to be alone. So there's all the animals, and Adam names all the animals and finds none that is a counterpart to him, for him. None, we might say there was no one that he found who could ride that teeter-totter with him. So then God causes a deep sleep to fall on Adam. God removes a curved part from Adam. And then only after that, and I'm just going to throw this out there because it's one of my favorite facts about the early portion of Genesis, only after that is Adam referred to as male. Prior to that, every time the word man is used, it actually should be human. So it's only after the curved part is taken out of Adam that now we have male and female in two bodies. So immediately after Adam breaks into poetry regarding Eve, immediately after that in the recording is the whole incident with the tree and the snake and the fruit. There's no record of unbroken fellowship with God. And I honestly believe that if Eve had had a real relationship with God, she couldn't have been deceived by the serpent as she was. So then after this incident, a curse is placed on the snake, and a curse is placed on the ground, and that's it. And that also is something that we tend to overlook. We tend to think that there was just this huge blanket curse that has affected everything. But according to Genesis, there was a curse on the snake and a curse on the ground only. And interestingly, the difference appears to have been that once Adam was banned from the garden, he was now going to have to work before he could eat. Whereas in the garden, it appears that he ate and then worked. So you can see how if you've got to work before you can eat, there's anxiety added to that. And that seems to be a lot of like the whole idea of him eating by the sweat of his brow. And there's just, it's not simply working. There's an anxiety to it. Like if I don't work, I'm not going to be able to eat. As opposed to I have everything I need provided for me, and now I work, I tend the garden, I do what I do because that's what I do. That's what I'm here for, which is two distinctly different mindsets there. And another interesting thing to notice about the curse on the ground is that after the flood, it's recorded that God said, "Never again will I curse the ground for man's sake," which doesn't explicitly say that the curse on the ground was then broken, but that seems to be the indication. And if that's true, then it means that what existed between Adam and Noah may be something that we can't even conceive of. Or it might be something more like living in a desert and scrabbling for everything you have. It's entirely possible that that's more or less like what Adam's life was. Because then after the flood, God says, "Never again will I curse the ground for man's sake." And then Noah became the first person to plant a vineyard, which kind of hints a little bit that until that time, the conditions weren't good enough for a vineyard to grow. Or perhaps it could indicate that something like vines, like grapevines, were such a luxury that prior to the flood, they wouldn't have had time to mess with something like that. They had to be concerned perhaps about their day-to-day existence, and something long-term or sweet like grapes was beyond what they were able to do with the resources that they had. We don't know. But the major point, obviously, that I'm trying to make in this is about responsibility, and that is that Adam was created for responsibility. He was created to act effectively when effective action was necessary. And it was expected that that was going to be his relationship with the garden that God placed him in. That brings us to our fantasies about heaven. Almost everything that I have heard, like popularly, about heaven, I don't know where it comes from, but I don't think it comes from the Bible. A lot of what we do get, the little smidgens that we do get about heaven from the Bible, very often come from the book of Revelation. And there are a couple of passages from the book of Revelation that I want to read here today. The first one is in Revelation 3, verse 12. The city of my God, which is the New Jerusalem, which comes down out of heaven from my God. Which I mention because if the New Jerusalem is coming down out of heaven, what's the big draw about being in heaven? Because wouldn't you want to be where the New Jerusalem was? Revelation 5, verse 10, and has made us unto our God kings and priests, and we shall reign on the earth. Now, This is not sitting on a cloud singing the Hallelujah chorus while strumming a harp. That's responsibility. We think of that in narcissistic terms, where ruling and reigning is all about me sitting back and getting my way. But that's not at all the concept of ruling and reigning that Jesus spoke about. And once again, he says that God has made us that Jesus has made us unto our God kings and priests, and we shall reign on the earth. Again, reigning on the earth. That's the point, the other little point that I want to make there. Revelation 11:19. And the temple of God was opened in heaven, and there was seen in his temple the ark of his testament, and there were lightnings and voices and thunderings, and an earthquake and great hail. And that was in the temple of God, as far as I can tell, in heaven. Thunderings, an earthquake, and great hail. That's not really something that I'm all that excited about. That doesn't sound like, oh, I hope when I die, I'll go to heaven where there's thundering and earthquake and great hail. You can get that here. There's no thrill for me in that. Then in Revelation 12, verses 1 through 4, and then jumping to 7, there appeared a great wonder in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun and with the moon under her feet, and upon her head a crown of 12 stars. And she, being with child, cried, travailing in birth, and pained to be delivered. Now, again, this doesn't really sound like our general idea of what happens in heaven. And there appeared another wonder in heaven, and behold, a great red dragon, having 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 crowns upon his heads. And his tail drew the third of the stars of heaven, and did cast them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman, which was ready to be delivered, for to devour her child as soon as it was born. I mean, we really have created some fantasies about heaven, because this is totally, this is absolutely not our idealized version of heaven. And then verse 7 says, and there was war in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon, and the dragon fought and his angels. Now, Michael won, of course, but there was war in heaven. If you're looking to get away from war, you're not going to get away from it in heaven, apparently. And then Revelation 21, 1 through 3, and I saw a new heaven and a new earth. For the first heaven and the first earth were passed away, and there was no more sea. And I, John, saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down from God out of heaven, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a great voice out of heaven saying, behold, the tabernacle of God is with men, and he will dwell with them, and they shall be his people, and God himself shall be with them and be their God. And I've got to say, I don't believe this is all out in the far distant future. The tabernacle of God, Jesus was called Emmanuel, God is with us. Do we really believe that God isn't with us now? And there's nothing in Revelation really that indicates that all of a sudden we'd have this amazingly different relationship with God than what we have or what we can have here and now. As I mentioned earlier, our fantasies about Eden, about heaven, about responsibility, they're all perfectly understandable given what most of us have experienced. It's pretty difficult sometimes to just be okay with life when it's been so dissatisfying for us. And it has been difficult for me to be okay with life as well, which has been part of the drive for me to understand more about partnership with God, relationship. But Jesus didn't come to relieve us of responsibility. He came to give us responsibility. He came to give us the power to act effectively when effective action is necessary. And he came to give us that with God. The power to act effectively when effective action is necessary in relationship with God and in our place in the world as well. So these are going to be topics that I will be frequently addressing in future videos. So we'll be getting little bits and pieces of that here and there as we go along. I look forward very much to speaking to you again soon. And until then, take very good care of yourself. You are worth it.
Pull a song out of the dirt and some music out of dreary work. All the trees are keeping time and the honeybees buzz in perfect rhyme. And there's a song they'd love for you to sing. It's a song that to them will bring new life to them and everything. So lift up your voice and sing. And pull a song out of the dirt and some music out of dreary work. All the trees are keeping time and the honeybees buzz in perfect rhyme. There's happiness in a world of tears. There's confidence in a world of fears. There's new life everywhere. So drop off your bundle of cares and live a little more. Show the world what you're here for. When you're done, give an encore. Live a little, laugh a little more. There's a song and a laugh and a rhythm and a rhyme. There's a tap in your toes to keep in time. There's a whirl and a twirl down in your heart. Part of you longs to start to live a little more. Show the world what you're here for. When you're done, give an encore. Live a little, laugh a little more. Life's kind of troublesome sometimes, with days of agony along the way. Your Father's got something on his mind, and if you're listening, you will hear him say, live a little, laugh a little more. Show the world what you're here for. When you're done, give an encore. Live a little, laugh a little more. There's a song and a laugh and a rhythm and a rhyme. There's a tap in your toes to keep in time. And there's a whirl and a twirl down in your heart. Part of you longs to start to live a little, laugh a little more. Show the world what you're here for. When